So pleasure to be here. My talk is a little bit more general. It's not so focused on payments, but it has a lot of relevance also for the payment space. My background is I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor, and I work a lot on digital platforms. And a new term that has been brought into the literature in the last 10 years or so, it's the concept of digital ecosystems. So this presentation is about that, how ecosystems can be encouraged to create more value through a concept that I call equitable interoperability. So let's start from the beginning. We have a lot of benefits, of course, with digitalization, but also a lot of concentration of power that is mainly driven by a few factors. So the first one is network effects. You probably know, the more you have friends that are using the same service that you're using, the more you get value out of this service. And so these network effects can refer to users of the same group. So again, people that use the telephone, the more that use the telephone, better for me because I can call many people. But also it can spread through different groups. So the more users you have on a social media, the more advertisers will want to go and push advertisements to them. So this is one phenomenon that leads to concentration into the hands of those who are there first. Second aspect is lock-in. So it's not very easy typically to move to another service because you have all this content and data that you have built into the previous service. So again, this makes some hindrance. In general, these companies that are growing bigger and bigger in digital markets, they get a lot of scale, in computing, infrastructure, but also economies of scope. So they are involved in many different activities that can bring externalities to their other activities. So basically, the more things you are doing at the same time, the more you become powerful because of all these things that you're doing. And one notable component of this is data. So if you collect data in one side, you can then use it on the other side in another market. So that leads again to entrenchment of a few players. All this also leads to a situation where users don't really understand all the terms and conditions of how they're being treated by these companies, particularly with regard to their data. And there is there is also a problem of unfair appropriation of value. So certain companies that work on top of digital platforms, they are not able to appropriate the value of their invention because these digital platforms that have an entrenched position will impose some fee, some percentage of their value creation that has to go to them, or they will have the ability to appropriate the data, which is particularly valuable. So in this context, and I'm also not seeing anything on my hand, so it's quite difficult, but I will just say that we had the challenge of dealing with this power traditionally through antitrust law. Antitrust law is a framework that tries to constrain the power of the biggest companies, but it operates ex post. And this means that you need to make a market investigation, figure out what is the relevant market, and then eventually you can establish that certain conduct in that market was causing harm to consumers. And then in that case, you can impose a remedy. But nowadays, we realize that this is quite burdensome and lengthy. So just to give an example, the most famous case was with regard to Google that favored its own price comparison service. So when you were doing a search and for a product, you would not see the price comparison services of other companies. Google integrated its own price comparison results and put it first in the general search results. So in doing that, basically, the investigation took 7 years to get to a decision. You can imagine that the market has already changed significantly after that. So now the new approach in digital markets is that authorities are applying an ex-ante approach, which means that they are saying at the beginning who are the players that are key, and then they're imposing some obligation on these players ex ante without having to do this investigation and so on. So this is the new approach. We have the Digital Markets Act that entered into force in Europe last year, and the Brazilian regulation that is very similar to that. They identify these 8 categories of platforms that will be subject to this treatment as long as they meet certain size thresholds. So then they have to comply with several obligations. Now, this is one approach. The alternative approach has come out this year from the South African Competition Commission. They did a market inquiry. They looked into who are the key players in 6 vertical segments. And so travel and accommodation, e-commerce, app stores, online classifieds, search, and online ads. What are the obligations that they impose? They are this kind of obligations. So you cannot use the data that you collect on one side in the other side. You cannot prevent users from porting the data to another place. You cannot hinder interoperability. But notably here, they refer to technical interoperability, so in a very specific way. You cannot force consumers to buy a secondary service from you, because you have this power, and you could leverage this power by mandating that user also buy the secondary service for you. So the idea is to protect the players in that secondary market. And finally, you cannot self-preference. So what Google did here, you cannot put your things first just because you want to steer competitors out. So what we are suggesting, me and some colleagues, is to have a more ecosystem-focused approach. So the difference between digital platform and ecosystem is digital platforms are essentially matchmakers. They bring different economic agents, different user groups on board. And without them, these user groups will not be able to generate value externalities. So as I was telling you earlier, social media is a good example. Without Facebook, Instagram, and so on, advertisers will not find, or at least so effectively, this bunch of users. So they are important because they manage these network effects. But digital ecosystem is a new idea. It's a group of players. It's not just about the platform. There's a number of players that work on top of the platform and that create value. It's not just a platform that creates value, right? It's all these third parties that provide applications and so on. And they all have some sort of multilateral and generic complementarity, meaning that you are complementary to another, but not only to that one. You are multilateral, and so with many people, is not just specific to one. And by doing that, you create value. Now, in order for this value to be effective, you need somebody that kind of controls, not hierarchically, so it's not part of your value chain. It's not like the distributor of a service that is done by somebody else that is part of the value chain, but it's really somebody that kind of creates the value vision and says, okay, we cannot accept this kind of practices in this ecosystem, and we accept these others. And they do that through terms of service and standard setting. So this leads to a situation where we are in a scenario where it's not like the firms that are getting bigger by integrating into many more activities. The traditional tier of the firm is the more you grow, the more you enter vertically into all the other activities that you need for your final product. Today, the companies that are big, they are very lean. They have few employees, and so they can be agile. And what they do is they just use these network effects to connect third parties. They realize that you have more value from connecting people than from integrating downstream, right? So this is a graphic that shows you that. And this is another view of ecosystems, because it's not just about connecting people. At some point, you start realizing that you have this bunch of users on different sites, and it's valuable to enter into one of the verticals. So after you have created all this mass, you enter the verticals, as the main GAFAM companies have done. And this is not a thing that is only of platforms. You can have ecosystems around product, around content. So if you think about Lost here, or the Walt Disney movies, they don't have just the movies, they have stories, they have merchandising. So you can use a brand as an innovation focal point around which third parties can produce a number of things. So this is where we can create equitable interoperability as a solution. It's not just about interface design that allows technical interoperability. Nowadays, we are discussing about a notion that is about treating people equally. It's not just enabled to interconnect. It's also about non-discrimination, non-exclusivity, non-preferential treatment of one over any other. And so this idea, I think, is very powerful and could be used in the future to regulate a number of key digital infrastructures. Now, the big questions for the future are, how do we define the boundaries of this infrastructure? Do we want to focus on some specific verticals? How do we identify the value creation that is enough to warrant this kind of treatment? So, of course, if some market is starting only, it doesn't have a lot of revenues generated, but maybe there's a lot of users. So it's already an ecosystem, it already has some value creation. And so should we subject it to some sort of interoperability mandate already? From which point we start that? So this is the first challenge. The second challenge is, how do we allow justifications for not providing an equal treatment? So you can have a famous case nowadays is, with regard to payments, is Apple that requires that people make payments of in-app purchases only using Apple Pay. And they don't allow other type of mechanisms because they think it's insecure or it has some flaws. So how do we define what is a legitimate defense against interoperability? I think that's one of the challenges. Maybe there will need more standardization around that. But I think the solution eventually has to come from an institutional setup that allows to hear these claims continuously, without a judicial litigation. So setting up an ADR system, an online or alternative dispute resolution, not going through court, where if you are a party that feels affected by discrimination or lack of technical interoperability, you will notify the player and you will wait for their explanation for this differential treatment. And if you're not satisfied, then you can go to this independent body, and that this body will evaluate the legitimacy of this claim, will hear evidence from the parties, but this, importantly, is not done through a burdensome judicial process, because although I'm a lawyer, I recognize that we are not helping with all the legal system complexity to stimulate innovation. So we need to create this institutional setup, and the big question is also what type of rules are going to apply to this framework in terms of the justification. Do we want to say that some justifications are already automatically, get out free card in the sense that they are dispositive, or should they always be an ability to rebut them? One of the big questions now in these digital markets is that big tech players have a lot of resources to drag the litigation on, and so if you allow them to rebut every claim, it will take forever. So maybe we should think about not necessarily closed rules, something in between. So presumptions that say this justification seem okay, or this kind of differential treatment, it starts from a default position that is wrong, and you need to produce evidence to say that actually this is warranted in this particular case. So I hope this brief overview gives us some lesson about the regulation of digital ecosystems in the future. Happy to discuss more in the break.